Soledad, what is your history in Cuba? What is your knowledge of Cuba, your lineage that runs through Cuba?
My lineage is that my mom is Afro-Cuban, and I probably go every 2 years to Cuba to do some reporting, starting when Pope John Paul II was in Cuba. So that was, what year was that? 80, 90 something, 92 or something. I have, no, probably more like 96. And my relatives, I'd say the bulk of them are there. On the other side of it, I'm not super knowledgeable about Cuba in that I have far more knowledgeable. And I think sometimes a lot of what I think about Cuba is colored by my relatives and their experiences. And sometimes that can be helpful. And of course, sometimes that can undermine your ability to report really well on certain things in the country. My Spanish is Spanglish. I was just out to dinner. Some of my relatives have made their way to Miami. And so I had dinner with them in Miami, and just trying to, their English is so much better than my Spanish. And of course, that impacts your ability to do a good job when you're reporting in the field. So I always travel with my producer who's fluent in Spanish. So it's kind of a complicated answer because in a lot of ways, I didn't learn a lot about Cuba when I was a kid. You couldn't go back. I had friends, who were Puerto Rican. They go back to see their grandmas, or Dominican, back to see their abuelitas, over the summer break. But if you're Cuban, it's like those people who you send money to. And so I don't know that I have a very good grasp of Cuba.
But you said that you go every couple of years. Is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Every 2 years, sometimes more.
Because, why is that important to you?
To see my relatives, for one, and to also, there was a big swath of time where we just didn't know our relatives at all. It's a very weird thing, I think, growing up without any cousins. My dad was Australian and my mom was Cuban. And so when you don't really know, in both cases, we didn't really have cousins that we grew up with. Occasionally someone would come over and we would know them, but that was a little strange. So yeah, definitely to go see my cousins, and often I could pitch a story or two. So for example, the last time I was there, we were looking at the cruise ship industry, which President Trump had sort of said, if you're a cruise ship, you can absolutely stop in Cuba, but then you can't stop in the US, which, so you started to see all those fledgling entrepreneurial businesses just die on the vine. And so I went to do a story on that, but also to see my cousins and catch up with them.
How sad are you when you're there? Because it's 90 miles away from America and freedom. And I imagine you see that your relatives are surrounded by a lot of limits.
Yeah, it's really sad and it's hard. I think sometimes I go and I try to support as much as you can of the people who are there. So you try to go and spend money with entrepreneurs and, make sure that you're helping people who are trying to build fledgling businesses. On the other hand, because I didn't grow up there, I don't think I have a good sense of just all that's been lost. My mother went back once and she said, never again. She said, Castro ruined the country. She's like, it was just so painful for her. So I definitely don't have that sense of walking around and feeling like it's just brutally painful. But I do think, as a lot of people who come and visit, you just think this is so completely fucked up. Like this could be solved in so many ways. And the people who are really hurting are the people who are really trying to figure it out. And it's just been that way for such a long time. The pandemic, economic sanctions, the economy in general, it's just terrible. And so it's really tough to see.
How would you describe your upbringing to a stranger?
So my full name is Maria de la Soledad Teresa Marchetti O'Brien, which loosely translated is the Virgin Mary. So that is how I would describe my upbringing to a stranger. My parents were very devout Catholics and pretty strict. I think that they had very high expectations as immigrants to this country. They had high expectations sort of academically, but also high expectations for you put your head down. And if anything is bothering you, you just let it roll off your back and you just keep plowing through. And I always thought that was a very good thing, but sometimes I think it's not such a good thing. Like I think I grew up in Long Island, and my parents, were, if anything, was my mom was a bit of a fighter, and so she was pretty good at that stuff. She fought for fair housing. I mean, we were the lone Black/Latino family in our community. But at the same time, I think a lot of immigrants have this, listen, we moved here for good schools and good opportunities. Put your head down, just keep plowing through no matter what. And so I think that's kind of how I was raised, succeed academically, put your head down if things don't go your way, and just keep pushing through.
But when you say not such a good thing, what are you thinking of there? Because obviously they helped make you someone ambitious, someone who cared. The cultural imprinting is obvious on your work, but I can speak to that mentality sometimes being joyless, where you just humbly accept whatever it is that's in front of you, because that's the immigrant and exile way of being grateful for everything this country gives you.
And I think it also doesn't necessarily help feeling like you belong. There's a lot of work that I've been reading recently. People talk a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion. It used to be diversity, then it was diversity and inclusion, then it was diversity, equity, and inclusion. But now it's moved to belonging. And I think actually that's the most interesting piece of it for me, because belonging is kind of how everybody wants to feel in a workplace, right? It's not just, hey, listen, there are X number of people. It's really about like, well, do people feel like they want to work here because they feel like their ideas are useful, right? I mean, and so I have been reading a lot about the science of belonging and the measurement of belonging. And I do think when your strategy is put your head down, don't say anything, just keep marching forward, you don't necessarily fight for the belonging part of it so much. And so, I think it means that I liked growing up in Long Island a lot. It was a very great place to grow up, but at the same time, I was very happy to leave. Like, I don't look back and think like, oh, if I could just get back to my hometown. It's very beautiful. And there's lots to recommend Long Island, but still and I think when you don't feel like you belong, you're kind of like, yep, I got out of it what I needed. And then we moved on. I don't know that that's such a good feeling for creating community, actually.
What didn't you fight for that you should have been fighting for because you were keeping your head down?
That's a great question. And I've only just started researching the science of belonging, so I'm not sure I've thought it through fully. But for example, at one point, probably when I was in about 8th grade, you begin to realize that all the books you're reading, and remember, I went to high school in the 80s, so these conversations were not happening at all. But you begin to realize like, oh, there are all these books that don't really, represent a wide swath of, you tick off the great books, but they're not super representative. There were some really interesting books that we could have been reading that we just didn't. In fact, when you go to college, you sort of open up your reading more. So we read, The Red Badge of Courage. Oh my gosh, think of there was a Middlemarch, and we just kind of sucked it up. But I think now if I were a parent in the school, I'd be like, wow, there's all these other more interesting books that are written by diverse authors, not just African Americans, but lots of really interesting diverse authors that we should talk about. Should we be putting them in the curriculum? Should we be doing a reading club? I mean, that just wasn't a conversation that was ever happening. And so I think things like that, where you could say, the community that I grew up in is much more diverse now. I mean, it used to be people were a handful of people were very hostile to the Black people who moved into my town. Like they didn't want them there. I mean, my parents couldn't buy a house in our neighborhood, when they got married in the 60s, so people were very clear, like, we literally don't want you. We can't make it more clear than we will not show you a house. We will not sell you a house. There'll be people who will march in your driveway. And I think it wasn't really a big deal, right? My dad went and got a house. Families where people were protesting kind of put their head down. And if they wanted to live there because it was a good neighborhood with good schools, they kind of got through it and their kids enrolled. Everybody was like, there was no critical mass of like, this is kind of crazy. What? Now it's just a different time, but I guess that's what I mean by thinking about like, well, how can this community be for everybody, and what are really your issues, so we can we can solve them.
What are the other things that leave a mark in not belonging as you look at your path?
I think what ends up happening probably more in the workplace is that you edit yourself. And in most of the jobs that I had in the last, say, 10 years or 15 now, 20 years, I had a lot of clout, right? So if I said something, I could move the needle quite a bit, but I do think you edit what you're trying to say because you're very worried. You don't want to be perceived as unpleasant, right? Or that girl, right? I've sort of embraced now being that girl, but there was a time when it's like, oh God, Soledad's going to advocate for more women. Oh God, she's raising her hand. She's going to wonder why there are no more Latinos working on this documentary about Latinos, and she's going to push back. And, when you're young in your career, who wants to be that person? I remember giving advice to a young guy who I worked with at NBC News, who was gay, and he was NBC at the time had I'm sure they still do, had they didn't call it employee resource groups, but that's what it was back then. That's a relatively new naming of it. And I remember all the things that he wanted to fight for. And he was a very young producer. And I told him, and I think this was accurate advice. Maybe it wasn't good advice, but you realize, if you become this guy as a 23-year-old young producer, it's going to kill your career, right? If you are the guy early on advocating, it's the older people who've been there a long time, who have some clout, who can better navigate that. But what terrible advice. I think it's accurate at the time, was accurate, but still, he left news eventually. But, I sort of understand that, this idea of, I can either advocate hard for gay rights, or I can, as a young gay guy in a newsroom, or I can keep my mouth shut and get good assignments and work with a lot of people, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure that's a choice people should have to make.
When and how did you come about embracing that? When you say I became that person? Yeah.
I think there is a lot of, you just don't give a shit at a certain age. So probably around 50, I think you really do. I think one of the nice things about getting older truly is being like, yeah, no, maybe my role is to be that girl, because I'm not at the beginning of my career, and I have a fair amount of clout, and I'm now self-employed, so I can really run a lot of projects the way I want to. And I can say, whether it's with people that I work with or places where I have, where I'm trying to get a job, if something's important to me, I'm really not too hampered by saying, this is what I'm going to need. It happens all the time. I've done projects where I'd say, listen, I'm looking at we're doing a show that's literally, the subject is about diversity, and the crew is not very diverse. So you realize that every time we bring a guest in, right, you should know that they're doing this. Huh. Okay. So we should just think about that. I don't think the job is a job of yelling at people, do what I need you to do. But I think it's let's only send messages that we want to send, because here's a message we're sending, and I'm not sure we want to send it. And I'm not even sure you realize it's a message you send. And so I think to be that person is actually quite helpful. And I think I'm now old enough to be able to have a lot of credibility on that front.
How do you come about making for Peacock then a documentary about Rosa Parks? What are the pieces that have to come in place on your imprinting for you to decide, I'm going to do this for the first time, right? It's not like this has been chronicled before.
Yeah, no, it's amazing that they haven't done a Rosa Parks documentary. First and foremost, I have to be interested in it. And I'm pretty curious about a lot of things. So we've just finished a doc about a guy who mailed himself literally out of prison. He escaped from prison 3 times, the third time mailing himself out. He was caught, and now he's in Supermax. And so we did a 2-part series for Discovery on that. And so not everything is about race and class and, et cetera, et cetera. It just has to be interesting to me. But in the Rosa Parks case, there was a great book about Rosa Parks, which is basically just how people, I think, the mythology of Rosa Parks is that she's very meek. She was just tired. She sat in decided she wouldn't get out of her seat. That mythology is not quite accurate. Rosa Parks was truly kind of a badass, and had been for a long time. She was truly an activist, and she was the right person to do a thing that they were trying to do in the bus boycott. And so I thought that, I love when we get to kind of jump into history and explain things better to people, especially a history everybody thinks they know. My kids, I remember when they were little and learning about Rosa Parks, used to say, yeah, Rosa Parks, she wouldn't get on the bus. I'm like, what? Yeah, she wouldn't get on the bus. She said, nope, I'm not getting on the bus. I'm like, oh gosh. But that's kind of how it's taught, right? These little phrases. She wouldn't move her seat. She wouldn't, as opposed to a little more nuanced and complex. And so the truth is that the book was amazing. The author of the book was reached out to by a couple of directors that I know that we wanted to work with. And we basically are going to all pull that together. But it's just a great, interesting story. I mean, it is interesting to us. There's a lot of stuff that I wouldn't do just because I don't think it's super interesting, or I don't think I don't love reality too much because I think I like people's real responses, not kind of acting responses. I like watching it sometimes, but I don't. But I don't know that would be something that would really move me to want to spend a lot of time on producing.
Cliff Notes: how did the inmate mail himself out of jail?
You'll have to watch. It's on Discovery Plus. It's called. What is it? I can't believe that I do not remember. It's going to pop into my head. This is the other downside of being old.
That's all right. We'll circle back around and get the name. I know you're gonna get stuck here. We will look it up for you and we will bail you out. But you're gonna have to give me the Cliff Notes while we're looking it up for you. Filibuster for me on giving me the details. How did the inmate escape from jail, mailing himself out of jail? So
he is such a smart guy who also killed a guy, but he mailed himself out when he finally, third breakout, he got a job in the mailroom, and he wrapped himself in mail bags. The job in the mail bag repair room in the prison. That's what they did, right? The cheap labor meant that they would repair these mail bags, and they would wrap them up and then wrap them in plastic and then put them on a pallet, right, and ship it over the walls of the prison. So he put himself in the middle of one, wrapped himself up, put talcum powder around the plastic wrap so that it wouldn't really stick, put made little tubes so he could breathe, and stuck food on his body. And they lifted him out of the prison, over the walls of the prison, and he was able to go free for about 18 months. And he was on the lam. Interestingly, it's so crazy. Like, he would record video of himself. There's a video, I think it's been seen like 16 million times on YouTube, of a cop that stops him in Louisiana and says, yeah, we're looking for a guy, but the description wasn't completely accurate. And he sweet talks his way out of it. His name is Richard Lee McNair, and you can Google it. I mean, it's amazing. It's a great story of a guy. Now, he eventually was caught, and how he got caught is also an amazing story, because Canadian authorities caught him, and they didn't believe. He was acting very suspiciously, but they didn't believe that he was one of the 10 most wanted people. He kept telling them, you guys got someone big. I'm one of the most wanted people. And they're like, yeah, shut up. We got some guy in the back of our vehicle. It's a crazy story. I think it's called, is it Prison Breaker?
The Prison Breaker is what it's called.
Yeah, we had you have your working title, then you have your real title. But yeah, it's a really great doc, and that's on Discovery Plus right now.
Right now on HBO Max, Black and Missing. How did you get involved with Black missing persons cases? Is the start of this outrage, or is the start of this being appalled somewhere because Black missing person cases are neglected in ways that often aren't true of other nationalities, ethnicities?
I think I would say it started by being exhausted, honestly, right? Because I've covered, by the way, all of those bold-faced name missing young women, white women stories, all of them. And it's terrible. I mean, sometimes I would just think, like, I cannot imagine being the parent of a young woman who goes missing. And then they get up and they do press conferences, right? And they beg for things. I mean, it's horrific. And I used to think, like, I don't think I'd even be able to get out of my bed if that ever were to, God forbid, happen to me. So, I've done a lot of those stories. And then you start to realize, like, wow, on the day that Laci Peterson went missing, all these other people went missing too. Why is the story of Laci Peterson, as crazy as it is, and worthy, I think, of covering, certainly, but why are all these other people not worthy? And what you begin to realize is that there's a real bias that I think media, but also sometimes law enforcement, have a sense of, like, what's a good, if you will, person to cover. Are they pretty? Is the story an interesting backstory? Are they wholesome? And so sometimes law enforcement would even say, well, we think this person is a runaway. But, if they're 15 and a runaway, they're still missing. And so it was very interesting to us. So I'd really been thinking about that a lot over the years. And then about 3 years ago, we started working with the Black and Missing Foundation about how to tell this story, this in documentary form. And in that time, as you well know, there have been many high profile missing white girl cases, and kind of proving, I think, the point of the doc to some degree, which is a lot of these cases just don't get the attention. The women, the sisters-in-law who run the Black and Missing Foundation would say it's not just the media and it's not just law enforcement, but also the community also has to decide that these girls are valuable, and make a stink about it, because that, it's this circle, right? It's if the media brings attention, then law enforcement feels the pressure. And if the community brings attention, then the media feels the pressure, And so really kind of helping get that narrative going around how do you make sure that everybody who's missing has their story told and is looked for, was really a goal of this documentary. It airs, by the way, on the 23rd and 24th of this month of November on HBO.
Broad question, but when you talk about belonging and you talk about everything from the imprinting of 8th grade books and the red badge of courage to learning as a journalist, oh, wait, right around me, these stories are covered differently. What do you make from that perspective of what's happened in America and this country that you love over the last 4 years?
I think one of the challenges in this country, because we're really reluctant in a lot of ways to have conversations about race that are not super easy, right? They sort of need to be navigated. And so I think you just see it come out, in these little fits and starts and fights in school boards about, and people suggesting burning books, right? Which all is just craziness. But at its core, to me, is the sense of we really haven't come to grips with American history. We love in this country, and maybe every country, a really sanitized, sometimes bullshitty view of American history. Christopher Columbus is a really good example. I did not know until I was well into my college years anything, outside of what I learned in school, Christopher Columbus. And I don't think somehow that diminishes his discovery, right? I do think understanding all the pieces of the person as you're celebrating and pointing out what he did is interesting too, and important, and it's actually accurate. So, so I think you start figuring out that we just haven't really wanted to sit down and talk about kind of the way it actually was. And I'll give you an example. You look at, I think it was Bill O'Reilly, who grew up in Levittown, if I'm not mistaken, in Long Island. Well, and he talked about his family. And sometimes people say my family, came from modest means, or they were hardworking, or they were working class people. All true. Absolutely. Amazing backstories, certainly. But just note, my family couldn't live in Levittown, because they didn't let Black people buy in Levittown. So as those real estate values have gone up and done better, and the people who lived there who were hard workers, and in many cases very good people, they had a value, they had, grew the value of their homes, they built wealth, while other people couldn't. I mean, it's just, and I think sometimes we don't put those things, we don't really explain them, or that, the GI Bill, which allowed, if you were a GI, you could go to college, except not if you were Black, right? Like, that's a big exception. So it's those kinds of things. I don't think, to me, it's not about, stealing somebody else's glory. It's just about saying, like, well, let's just actually accurately explain how it was. I think that's kind of the strategy.
Another broad question, but your thoughts on the state of journalism as you continue to do very strong, thorough, fair work that I think has sort of morphed into activism on occasion, but activism that is, buoyed by fact.
I was thinking about that the other day because someone called me an activist, and I'm like, I guess if the question is like, are you against racism? Yes, for sure. Are you against trafficking of young women, 100%. I mean, am I an activist? Because I feel, yes, if that makes you like fully 100% against, should people be killed? No. Yeah, I think that's bad. So, pedophilia, terrible. So, I mean, in a way, I feel like, yes, there are certainly things that I feel very strongly about that are right and wrong. And I would never, as a journalist, go into like, let's really talk about if being a racist is okay. I just don't think that's the way to do it. So I'm not sure I'm an activist in the classic sense of I don't go on marches. I just try to tell stories about things that I think are undercovered. And the idea that in and of itself is activisty, which is not really a word, but is kind of unusual, right? I mean, that you're just trying to insert people back in a narrative where they've kind of been missing. So I guess I don't think of myself truly as a classic activist, and I've never really had an interest in doing that. I think it's much more of saying, well, let's just talk about the actual thing that happened, and really make sure people are clear on some of the.
But the reason I ask you about the state of journalism, though, is because you have your imprinting, and you are interested in storytelling, and you are a fair storyteller. But you've seen what has happened to the news, where it has become side taking and it has become politicized, and the kind of journalism that you're doing, I think most reasonable people can embrace, but that's not exactly the state of journalism.
Yeah, I think you're talking about political journalism, and I'm not really a political journalist. So I do think it's messy. And I don't even think it's about side taking is the big problem. I think a lot of the problem is this idea that everything is equal, that they just really don't want to call a thing a thing. I remember in the Trump presidency trying to, encourage the New York Times to I think it was Maggie Haberman who said something was just factually untrue. And you're like, that's a lie, right? When someone lied, you wouldn't say to your kid, well, that is factually untrue. You'd be like, don't lie to me. And so I think there was this tremendous hesitancy to just back off and not say things very clearly and directly. And I'm not 100% sure why, but many journalists do it, or even to do this both sides. Well, Hillary's doing this and Trump's doing that. And I think that's just a very problematic way of framing. There was a great example the other day in the New York Times about the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. And it was this long-winded, he was a young man who was looking for belonging in a team, in a community. Then you're like, literally, this is such a bizarre, what makes someone frame it this way when there's 10 other ways to think about framing a story? So I do think framing more than anything is what drives me crazy about our political journalists, because I think they fail on that front a lot. So I think political journalism in this country is a mess because they don't know how to deal with people who lie. I personally don't put people on TV who lie. If you lie, you just won't come back. And listen, and I'll let you go to the line of spinning, of overstating, of bragging, but like an out and out lie is problematic. And I remember when Kellyanne Conway, talked about alternative facts, and Chuck Todd's reaction was not, we don't do that here on this show, which is Meet the Press. We deal in facts. We deal in accurate facts and information. And so if you want to deal in alternative facts, you cannot be on this show. He was booked on a zillion shows after that. He kind of giggled through. I mean, if you go back and watch the clip, he sort of giggled through that. I mean, I just think that's kind of where we are. And that's very disappointing, obviously, to me.
What pisses you off?
I think when you see things that are so clearly written by journalists who just need clicks, and I know they do, because often people will send me their articles and say, you'd really be helping me out if you could, boost this, because that's how they're measured, right? It's sort of a, did it glom onto people's hearts and minds? And listen, I know perfectly well, having done a lot of documentaries. There are documentaries I did that were phenomenal that nobody watched. And there are documentaries that I did that were like, yes, all right, that people love, And so this idea that, sort of your worth is based on clicks, I just don't think, I don't think that has to be a hard and fast, or should be a hard and fast rule. And so I think that what drives me crazy is this idea that, I'm going to spin this tweet or whatever for social media because I need people to be outraged and click through it. When you read the story, and the story is nothing like that. It's just inaccurate framing, but it does help move the story along.
Did you know what you wanted to be early in life?
Yeah. First, I was going to be a hot walker at the racetrack. A hot walker is, I think they have machines for it now, but it's this girl who walks the hot race, the race horses when they get too hot after they run. So I was going to walk them around. I don't know how good that job would be. And then I was going to go to be a hairdresser. And then when I was in college, I was going to go to medical school. So I had done a lot, actually. I was a nurse's aide, and which, by the way, paid amazingly well. I mean, at the time when the minimum wage was $3.35, I was making $10 an hour because I had a certificate. I had a license to be a nurse's aide, and then I worked in a pharmacy. Kind of did all these things in order to become. To go to medical school. And then I really realized that it was just not my passion. It wasn't for me. So it was really from then that I discovered journalism, mostly by working in a newsroom and realizing like, oh, I have some skills here. Maybe this could be for me. But I didn't start off with like a deep passion for journalism when I was 10 years old.
Did you end up in the medical field because it's something that the culture or your family thought would be good for you as opposed to something that you simply loved?
That's such a great question. My parents were pretty cool about that stuff. They never had any designs on what someone should be. So I don't think, I never thought that they didn't put pressure on. I mean, I had lots of friends who were like, you should be a doctor because I was from Long Island. I'm like, what? You should be a doctor, but not my parents. But I think I definitely felt like that was a career that was good and useful and, and like a really good career. I didn't have a lot of examples of others. My mom was a teacher. My dad was a professor, and I knew I didn't want to be in academia, or teaching. But I thought, and I liked helping people was kind of my gut. But I think what ends up happening is you begin to recognize, well, there's lots of ways to help people, and you just have to figure out the way that's most interesting for you.
What are you proudest of professionally?
Oh, professionally, I was going to say my kids.
No, I wasn't going to let you do that, though. That's why I threw the professional
it's really
in there.
true, though. I got to tell you, though, that is not a lie, because you see your kid do something nice and you think like, wow, that's pretty great. Proudest of professionally, I think a real turning point in my career was my coverage of Hurricane Katrina. And partly we just were working a ton and we were on air a lot. But I think for me in my head, it was a moment when I began to understand this idea that, the story is not about a storm, that there was this whole world of undercovered things about access and opportunity and who's valued and who's not, and if a bunch of people in suburban Connecticut, were underwater and sitting on their rooftops, I can guarantee you that they would have been picked up a lot faster than the folks in New Orleans were, and so you sort of see that laid out. And as a relatively youngish reporter, you begin to understand like, oh shit, how do I connect the dots on this? This is very complicated, but it's certainly not just a storm. And it's not just about haves and have-nots. It's a combination of what motivates people. And again, I think it's where I get interested in covering policy, right? Because it's who's valued is always reflected in policy. We can see it very clearly where highways, off-ramps go really tells us a lot about, and don't go, tells us a lot about who's valued and who has clout and who has, who's able to get politicians to work for them and who cannot. I think that was the start of me trying to figure those things out.
What do your parents call you growing up? When did you become Soledad? And you did say, right? You said, named after the Virgin Mary. The full name is the Virgin Mary.
Yeah, well, Maria de la Soledad is Mary of the Solitude. So I, because I'm from Long Island, I was Soli, S-O-L-I, with a heart over the I-E when I was in elementary school, middle school, and probably a little bit of high school. And then when I went to college, I became Soledad, although some people kept calling me Soli. As you know, when you're in trouble, you're Soledad. Saul. My dad was Australian, so he used to say, "Hey, Saul." And my siblings called me Soli, and my best friends called me Soli. My coaches called me O'Brien or Obi when they were yelling at you to go do stuff. So kind of, I always could tell how I knew somebody by what they called me.
How could you tell that your parents were different, that their union was different beyond the idea that you weren't welcome in certain places?
I don't think their union was very different at all. I think they were strictish parents. When I got married, I think my husband's parents, we actually were raised very similarly in every which way. Parents who had rules and were kind of strict, but also I don't think wanted to put a lot of pressure on you to accomplish things, but they definitely had high expectations. I think there was a sense of never said, certainly, but like a lot's been given to you. You've had a lot of opportunities, so you kind of should run with it. And no one ever did to whom much is given, much is required. I think my dad certainly didn't speak like that, but it was kind of expected. Like you've got this great opportunity, don't screw it up.
But you saw them working hard, correct? Like you saw, like you didn't have any choice other than to embrace the immigrant mentality.
Yeah, I think I was very fortunate, and my husband and I run a small foundation now. And I think what you realize very quickly is there is a tremendous advantage in being middle class, right? Which is, I had parents who were together. Their jobs were never in jeopardy. To a lot of the students that we take in and we give scholarships to, they have parents who are in and out of work. They have parents who may not be together. They have domestic violence in their lives, right? And you just, like my childhood was just boring. It was very stable. It was very boring. And you look back now and you think, wow, that's incredibly lucky. That's a real advantage to never have to. A lot of my scholars would think about, like, I'm not sure when I'm going to have a chance to eat today, or if I have enough money to eat over the next 3 days. Like, we never had that. My parents didn't have a ton of money, but they never had no money. And so they would say to us, of course, I'm not going to buy you designer jeans. I was in the era when Jordache came out. My mother's like, first of all, those are too tight. Nobody needs to see your behind. And also, who's spending $60 on jeans? It's ridiculous. But a lot of our scholars, it literally was, we might lose the house, we might lose our jobs, or they did lose their jobs. So I really went through life feeling like I was just very lucky to have that sense of stability in your life, just feeling like very stable. And that's what we tried to give the young women we have in our foundation. Like, you know what, we're going to figure it out. Your tuition's going to be paid for till you graduate. And by the way, you're going to graduate, or we're all going to die trying, but you're going to get through. And I think that to me was really critical. And so, my parents were hard workers, but I also learned what it meant to be in an office. A lot of my scholars, their parents didn't work in an office. They have no idea. And guess what? When you see your mom and dad in an office, you know what to wear to an office. You know how to behave in an office because you grew up in an office. My kids grew up in TV studios. They utterly exactly know how. As little kids, they used to plant on the floor and no, do not lift your head up. You're going to get hit by the jib at some point. Like, they know TV news very well. Those are advantages you get in how to navigate that not everybody gets.
Her new show on HBO is called Black and Missing. All episodes are available to stream on HBO Max. If you're interested in that foundation she was talking about, Powerful is what it is called. How can they find that? It's mentoring women, sending them to college. It's a foundation you started about a decade ago. How can they find that?
Yeah, we're online at Powerful Foundation, FDT. So you can find us online, or you can just hit me up. I'm on Twitter and actually every social media at Soledad OBrien.
Thank you. Appreciate your time and appreciate your work, Soledad. Thank you for spending this time with us.